These two I words, innate and instinctive, are ones that you've probably heard tossed around an awful lot in different arenas. But what do they really mean? What do they actually imply? So that's what we're going to consider here. Let's first talk about innate behavior. This is behavior that is species typical, meaning that all members, or at least same-sexed members of a particular species, will engage in this particular form of behavior. That's what we mean by species typical. And no experience, and they really mean no experience, is required for the development of this behavior. It just matures all by itself, and then it happens. In other words, the behavior is coded in the genes. Okay, well, here's where I depart with innate behavior, because genes don't code for behavior, they code for proteins, which code for other proteins, which code for other proteins, blah, blah, blah. So, this is a non-concept for me. I just don't buy it. However, I do buy this instinctive behavior. It's still species typical, so all same-sexed members of the same species will do it. Sometimes both sexes will do it, depending on the behavior in question. But experience is required for it to develop. But don't take experience to mean like learning or something like that. Experience can be obvious forms of experience, things that are related directly to what that developed behavior will end up being, but they can also be very subtle or non-obvious forms of experience, and we'll be looking at those in other segments. So generally, most ethologists agree that there are 4 characteristics that can be attributed to instinctive behavior. The first is that, yes, they are stereotyped, meaning that if you see the behavior once and then you see it again, you should be able to recognize it as pretty much the same behavior. Obviously, it won't be perfectly identical to the one you saw before. There's variability within an individual and certainly among individuals, but it should be stereotyped enough that you should be able to identify what behavior that happens to be. And yeah, like I said before, it's species typical. And it appears in animals reared in isolation, but don't take that too literally. There are different forms of isolation. There is no such thing as total isolation other than death. You can attenuate certain forms of experiences or conditions that the animal finds itself in as it's being reared. You can certainly rear it in the dark, and in which case you've attenuated light experience. You can put it in a soundproof chamber, so you've eliminated outside sounds. What you cannot do is isolate an animal from itself. In other words, I'm talking about self-stimulation, and we now know that that can be incredibly important in the development of species-typical behavior. And finally, no apparent practice is required. Yeah, so you don't have to practice flying to fly, but there are other things that contribute to the development of flying. I'm talking about birds actually right now, not us flying around in airplanes. Though you could use that as an example as well if you wanted to. But going back to birds, you have to have certain types of motor activity occurring in the wings, both prenatally and postnatally, that are not flying per se, but that will ultimately contribute to the development of flying. And I'm sure you can now make up all your other examples you want in terms of our own behaviors, where various kinds of non-obvious experiences are crucial to the development of some behavior. Okay, so if you like Venn diagrams, some of us do, some of us don't, here are the 2 Venn diagrams for innate and instinctive behavior. So innate, no experience, instinctive experience, and what they have in common is they are both species typical and stereotyped. So I'm going to be focusing on instinctive behavior because, again, I just do not buy into the concept of innateness. With that in mind, let's look at some categories of behavior that are very common in the ethological literature. They go back to the classic ethologists, meaning people like Lorenz and Tinbergen, von Frisch, back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, etc. Nowadays, people tend not to use these terms very much, but you will see them from time to time. So, this is more of historical value, but it might help sort things out. So a fixed action pattern, often abbreviated FAP, is in fact species typical, and it is initiated by a stimulus. You need a stimulus to get this FAP going, this fixed action pattern set into motion. Interestingly, it will continue to occur even if you now remove the stimulus, once the stimulus has initiated the sequence of behaviors. And there is something that is called a taxis, which is a variable component to the fixed action pattern. Now, this has been modified somewhere, I think around the 1980s, thereabouts, by an ethologist. He figured that nothing can be totally fixed, and so he posited the term modal action pattern, or MAP, which kind of takes into account the inherent variability of any given behavior pattern. Nothing is going to be rigidly fixed. So it's basically the same thing. It's just another word that accounts for the inherent variability of behavior. Fixed action pattern, modal action pattern, call it whatever you want. So here's an example of a fixed/modal action pattern. And it's often used as a good example of this. It's called egg retrieval in geese. And so if you displace an egg, or the goose accidentally kicks it out of the nest while shifting its position so it rolls out of the nest, it will engage in some very stereotyped movements to draw it back into the nest.
Mother Goose is a mindful parent. Should a precious egg roll out from the nest, she perceives the problem and responds intelligently.
So it will typically reach out with its neck and then slowly draw the egg back into the nest. But eggs are not perfectly round. And even if they were, that wouldn't matter, come to think of it. They're oval in shape. And so, they're going to tend to want to roll off to one side or the other. So as she's drawing her head back, she engages in these side-to-side swipes to make sure that the egg does not get displaced from her bill as she's rolling it back. And it's those side-to-side swipes that are the taxis components of this, because they are more variable. They are going to vary in accord with what the egg is doing. Is it rolling off to the left? Is it rolling off to the right? Whatever. So that's the variable component, the taxis component of this fixed action pattern. Now notice this very old, horrible film as this experimenter is taking away the egg. So the egg starts the sequence, but you remove the egg and the sequence continues. What people like Lorenz and Tinbergen claimed is, although the sequence continues in terms of it drawing its head back, once you remove the egg, what will die out is the taxis component, because there's no stimulus there to keep the variable taxis component going. The fixed part will continue even in the absence of the stimulus. And so that's why one of the defining characteristics of a fixed action pattern is that the behavior will continue once the stimulus is removed, but the stimulus is necessary to get it started in the first place. If there's no egg outside the nest, the bird is not going to be doing this. And so this is actually a field experiment, but a more modern one that was done to, I guess, replicate some of the earlier experiments by Tinbergen. So the egg is rolled out and it's putting it back in. Only it's right by its side, so it's not going to... Now, so here's an artificial egg, obviously. Look how big it is. And the goose doesn't care. As far as it's concerned, it's one of its eggs. So it tries to roll it in. This one's even bigger. Oh my gosh. It's pathetic. It can't get it underneath of itself. This one's not even an egg-shaped thing. It's a block. But it manages to get it underneath. Anyway, that's egg retrieval. Oh, and this one's an egg, but it's big and it's red. It doesn't care what color it is. It's egg-shaped, so it's going underneath of itself. Okay, that's egg retrieval. Now, this is another piece of vocabulary from the ethological literature that's different from a fixed action pattern. It's called a consummatory act. This is goal-oriented behavior, and this is a term that was given to us by Wallace Craig in the very early 1900s. This is goal-oriented, meaning that it's a drive-reducing behavior. It's related to biological drives, like eating and drinking and sexual behavior. Now, it too has a stereotyped component to it. And it's the stereotyped component that finishes the behavior. It terminates this act, the consummatory act. But there's an appetitive behavior component that is variable. It's the beginning of what will ultimately become the consummatory act. It's the initial searching or orienting phase toward whatever stimulus will ultimately be consumed. Think about it. Okay, so you're hungry. So that's a hunger drive right there. Okay, it's a biological drive. So you're going to go out and you're going to look for food. But you know that's going to vary from time to time. You're not going to do exactly the same thing every time. That's part of the appetitive behavior. And then, you're going to handle the food differently with your hands, a hamburger or whatever. And so that's going to be variable. And ultimately, you will swallow the food. You will ingest the food. That would be the actual consummatory act, the stereotyped component. Once you get that sucker in your mouth and you actually ingest it. But everything leading up to that is going to have a lot of variability to it. So those are the appetitive behaviors that precede this goal-oriented consummatory act. So if we compare these two things side by side, a fixed action pattern and a consummatory act, the fixed action pattern is not drive reducing. There's no biological drive there. The stimulus, the egg outside the nest is not a biologically motivated stimulus as such. It's not going to reduce a biological drive, whereas the consummatory acts are drive reducing. Okay, there's no refractory period for a fixed action pattern where there is for a consummatory act. Now, think back to the video that I just showed you of when the egg was repeatedly displaced from the egg, from the nest, or a new form of egg-type stimulus was presented. It didn't matter. The bird immediately tried to retrieve it. Whereas for a consummatory act, there is a refractory period. There is a period that you're not going to want to engage in that behavior again. A certain amount of time has to elapse before you will probably engage in that behavior. So if you're going to eat a hamburger, suppose it's a big hamburger, a double Whopper with cheese. They're awesome. Okay. And, if you've just eaten that, chances are you're going to wait at least a little while before you're going to want another one. There is a refractory period. So, again, the fixed action pattern is initiated by an external stimulus, but the consummatory act is not necessarily initiated by an external stimulus. I mean, maybe if you saw a food item, it might want you to go searching for that food, but you don't have to. All you need to be is hungry. You don't have to see the stimulus to start looking for it. And then the fixed action pattern, like I said, is independent of the external stimulus once it's initiated, whereas the consummatory act obviously is dependent on it. You got the hamburger in your hand, someone yanks it out of your hand, there's nothing to consume. You cannot engage in the consummatory act. So that's how these two things differ. Okay, let's look at Konrad Lorenz's theory of instinctive behavior because I've alluded to it in a couple of other segments. Part of his theory, well, actually a very central part of his theory, is this imaginary entity called action-specific energy. This is energy that is somehow earmarked for a specific behavior and that does not affect other types of behavior. So you'll have an action-specific energy for eating something, or you'll have an action-specific energy for drinking something, or whatever. Okay? The metaphor for Lorenz's theory is this: a toilet. It's often called the flush toilet model, and you'll see why in a minute because of the way Lorenz drew the model. This, by the way, is a German toilet. And if you use some imagination, you can imagine why it's probably not a place you would spend a lot of time reading a magazine. Yeah, use your imagination. Okay, so there's Lorenz's model as he drew it. So let's look at the different components of this model. Here we have action-specific energy flowing into this tank, and the level will rise in this tank. That's basically the tank on the back of your toilet. Okay, this is why it's called the flush toilet model. So the water level will rise, so it will be ready to be released at some point. Here is a spring valve. So notice that if this valve gets pulled in, because the valve is right now, it's holding the action-specific energy in. If it's pulled in this direction, it will allow the action-specific energy to flow out. Aha! The spring valve corresponds to, guess what? Guess which ethological concept? Any guesses? Some of you are right, and some of you are wrong. And some of you have no idea. It's the IRM, the innate releasing mechanism. Okay, so remember, that's this hypothetical mechanism internal to the organism that sort of is attuned to some kind of a stimulus that will then release this behavior. So the behavior being released here is whatever is happening with this action-specific energy. Well, sort of, kind of. Just stay tuned. We'll be there in a second. Okay. Now there's the spring pan. So notice that there is a weight on the spring pan. So once we have a weight on the spring pan, it's going to be enough to pull open the spring valve, the IRM, to release the action-specific energy. Okay? Follow that? If there's no weight, then it's going to stay shut. Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. We'll be there in a second as well. The weight is assigned stimulus. I should have asked you first, but okay, whatever. This is a graded trough. Graded in the sense that it's not flat all the way across, but rather there's a deep end and a shallow end like a typical swimming pool. So once water fills a swimming pool, obviously it's going to start first accumulating in the deep end and gradually work its way up to the shallow end of the pool. So look what's happening here. The action-specific energy, once it's unleashed by the opening of the spring valve because of a weight on the pan, assigned stimulus, it's going to start flowing into this trough. It's going to first fill the lower end and then work its way up to the upper end. The lower end is the taxis, the variable component, and the upper end is the actual consumatory act, just working in these terms into Lorenz's model. That's basically the model. Again, it's a metaphor. So think about it. We've already seen a couple ethological concepts portrayed in this model. We've seen the IRM, we've seen the sign stimulus, the consumatory act, and the taxis. What do you think is the ethological concept represented by no weight on the pan that would then still open the IRM, simply forced by the accumulation of action-specific energy? In other words, the action-specific energy gets so high that even with no weight on the pan, it's going to force the valve open, spilling out the action-specific energy and the performance of a species-typical behavior. What concept is that? I'm not going to tell you. You have to figure that out. And here's the other one. What if you had, instead of this kind of a weight on the pan, a very heavy weight on the pan? What ethological concept is that? I'm not going to tell you. Sorry. If you don't know the answers to those two questions, you need to go back and probably watch the segment on ethological concepts stimuli. And then I think you'll be able to figure this out. So anyway, Lorentz revised this model shortly before he died, and he drew it this way. Now, this is just crazy. No ethologist I know understands this model, and Lorentz is dead, so no one's ever going to know, probably. Look what he's done. He's taken away the spring pan. The IRM is still there, the spring valve, but no stimulus. Oh my gosh! And now not one spigot up here, but 4, plus additional ones from this disembodied hand holding this beaker that's spilling even more action-specific energy. Whatever. Anyway, no one gets this, so don't worry about it. But maybe the first one would be something to worry about for at least historical value in terms of trying to understand some of those ethological concepts. So for now, that is where we're going to conclude.